Hello MUS 2020 students. This is a quick explanation of texture, which is something you're going to want to pay close attention to, particularly in your first composition. Texture is a description of how the various parts, melody, harmony, and rhythm are arranged in a composition. It is a bit nebulous though. You can have technical terms related to the melody, like monophonic, which is one thing playing, homophonic, where everything is playing at the same rhythm, usually in harmony to support the independent melody. Kind of like a hymn, or a singer with a backup guitar, keyboard, and drums. Polyphonic, which is a harmonic, rhythmic free-for-all, but typically occurs mostly in classical music. Or heterophonic, where everyone is playing the same melody, but with different elaborations on it, all at once, which is very common in traditional Arabic, Indian, and other folk styles. Other ways to describe texture are thin, sparse, or brittle, for something like monophonic, or thick, lush, and enveloping, for polyphonic textures. In electronic music, we're mostly using the less technical terms like thin, sparse, lush, etc. to describe what you're hearing and how many things you're hearing. So if I start this piece, it's thin and monophonic. But if I jump ahead, it gets fuller with more instruments added and approaches homophonic when the bass comes in. Nothing really dominates the texture. Like I said, it's starting to approach homophonic, but doesn't really have kind of that classical music delegation of roles between the bass, the drums, and the lead. Further on, we have a very sparse section of just drums and a little bit of a bass pulse. It's kind of pointillistic, which, if you're an art lover, you've probably already seen George Seurat's Sunday on La Grande Jatte. If I take a look at this painting, you can kind of make out individual little brush strokes, but zooming in, you can actually see the individual dots of color made from every single brush stroke that when I zoom out forms the picture as a whole. And that's somewhat similar to what I've got here at bar 17. Lots of interesting little points that are kind of interesting in the and of themselves, but only when you pull back and see the whole do they really come together. Continuing on, I add a second drum beat. At this point, we have a very interesting effect of two textures that are kind of fighting each other. It's more complicated and more interesting. Sort of polyphonic, but for rhythms. So, polyrhythmic maybe? Not entirely, but it's pretty close. Here, at 29, I have all of the parts playing together. Very contrasting. This is getting really full and interesting. However, it still is homophonic, with all the parts supporting the melody. Now, let's listen to what happens when I remove sections and start experimenting with the texture. Here, the texture is thinned out by removing the melody, and then further removed the bass to make it even more contrasting. you're going to hear bass alternating with drums. This lets the drums really pop out and become more significant for just a couple of beats. Pretty cool effect. Going forward, you'll hear how that works when I bring the lead back as well. Huge surprise when that synth comes in out of nowhere and everything else drops out. It's strictly monophonic, then the drums add rhythmic counterpoint, with finally the bass coming back in at bar 65 to create a homophonic texture, adding a supporting roll and really thickening everything up. And at that point, I need to figure out an ending to this piece. But that's just a basic explanation of some of the textures we'll be discussing throughout the rest of this course.